Sarah Mitchell wiped down the espresso machine for the third time that evening, her movements precise and methodical. The coffee shop had been quiet since the afternoon rush ended, leaving only the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of Seattle traffic filtering through the large windows. At 32, Sarah had perfected the art of blending in. Her sandy brown hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes were practical rather than fashionable, and she had a way of moving through life that drew little attention. The customers who frequented Brew Haven knew her as the reliable barista who remembered their orders and offered a genuine smile with their morning coffee. She was the woman who stayed late to help close, who covered shifts when others called in sick, and who had never once raised her voice or lost her temper, even during the busiest morning rushes. To them, Sarah was simply Sarah, dependable, quiet, unremarkable. What they didn't know was that Sarah Michelle Mitchell had spent 8 years as a Navy SEAL, one of the first women to complete the grueling training program. They didn't know that beneath her soft-spoken demeanor lay a warrior who had completed 3 tours of duty in Afghanistan, who had earned a Bronze Star for valor, and who could neutralize a threat faster than most people could process what was happening. They didn't know because Sarah had chosen to leave that life behind, trading combat boots for coffee beans and military precision for the simple pleasure of crafting the perfect latte. The transition hadn't been easy. After her final deployment, Sarah had struggled with what civilian life meant for someone who had spent nearly a decade in high-stakes situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between life and death. The coffee shop had become her sanctuary, a place where the biggest crisis was running out of oat milk during the morning rush. She had deliberately chosen this quiet life, this anonymous existence where she could heal from the things she had seen and done in service to her country. Her apartment, just 6 blocks from the coffee shop, reflected this same desire for simplicity. The furniture was minimal but comfortable, the walls decorated with landscape photographs rather than military awards. The only hint of her past life was a locked cabinet in her bedroom closet containing medals, commendations, and photographs of friends who hadn't made it home. She had boxed up that part of herself, believing it was better left in the past. Sarah's daily routine was comfortingly predictable. She woke at 5:30 each morning, completed a workout that would have challenged most professional athletes, but which she considered basic maintenance, and arrived at work by 7 to open the shop. She knew the names of the regular customers, their preferred drinks, and small details about their lives that they shared during brief morning conversations. There was Mrs. Chun, who ordered a double-shot cappuccino and always asked about Sarah's weekend plans. There was Marcus, the college student who studied at the corner table every Tuesday and Thursday, always ordering the same vanilla latte with an extra shot. There was Detective Rodriguez, who stopped by before his night shifts and had once mentioned that Sarah had an unusual awareness of her surroundings for a barista. The comment had made Sarah more conscious of how she carried herself. Years of training had made certain behaviors automatic. The way she positioned herself to always have a clear view of entrances and exits, how she unconsciously assessed everyone who walked through the door, the way she moved with a controlled grace that spoke of physical conditioning far beyond what her job required. She had worked to soften these habits, to appear more ordinary, more civilian. Her co-workers at the coffee shop, Jenny and Paul, saw her as the anchor of their small team. Jenny, barely 19, and working her way through community college, often sought Sarah's advice about everything from dealing with difficult customers to navigating complicated relationships. Paul, the shop's assistant manager, relied on Sarah's steady presence during stressful periods. Neither suspected that their calm, helpful colleague had once led rescue operations in hostile territory and had been trained to survive in conditions that would break most people. The evening of the incident had started like any other Thursday. The 3 of them had worked together to serve the after-work crowd, a mix of commuters grabbing coffee for the road and students settling in for evening study sessions. As closing time approached, Jenny and Paul had begun their usual routine of cleaning equipment and counting the register while Sarah handled the few remaining customers. One of these customers was Emma Rodriguez, Detective Rodriguez's teenage daughter, who had started coming in occasionally over the past few months. Emma was 17, a high school senior with dreams of studying environmental science in college. She was shy but friendly, often staying late to study while waiting for her father to finish his shift and pick her up. Sarah had grown fond of the girl, appreciating her quiet determination and the way she treated the coffee shop as a refuge from the pressures of teenage life. That evening, Emma had claimed her usual table in the back corner, textbooks spread across the surface as she worked through calculus problems. She had ordered her standard hot chocolate with whipped cream, and Sarah had brought it to her table with a chocolate chip cookie, a small gesture that had become routine between them. "How's the studying going?" Sarah had asked, noting the frustrated expression on Emma's face. "Calculus is trying to ruin my life," Emma had replied with a dramatic sigh that made Sarah smile. "I swear these problems are designed to make me question all my life choices." "Sometimes the hardest challenges teach us the most about what we're capable of," Sarah had said, words that carried more weight than Emma could have known. "You'll figure it out. You always do." As the evening wore on, the coffee shop gradually emptied until only Emma remained, lost in her studies while Jenny and Paul finished their closing duties. Sarah had been wiping down tables when she noticed the group of men outside, their behavior immediately setting off alarm bells that she had trained herself to ignore in civilian life. There were 4 of them, ranging in age from late teens to early 30s. They had been lingering outside for nearly 20 minutes, occasionally peering through the windows, but not entering. Their body language spoke of nervous energy and barely contained aggression. The oldest one, a man with a shaved head and visible tattoos covering his neck, kept checking his watch and scanning the street as if watching for something or someone. Sarah's training kicked in automatically, cataloging details without conscious thought. The group's positioning suggested they were planning something. The way they kept glancing at the coffee shop's entrance indicated their interest was focused on the building. The fact that they had waited until the shop was nearly empty was not coincidental. She moved to the front window, pretending to straighten chairs while getting a better view of the men. The oldest one was clearly the leader, giving subtle directions to the others with hand gestures and quick words. The youngest looked nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot and repeatedly touching his pocket in a way that suggested he was carrying something he was uncomfortable with. "Everything okay?" Paul asked, noticing Sarah's focused attention on something outside. "Just keeping an eye on things," Sarah replied, her voice carefully neutral. She didn't want to alarm her co-workers unnecessarily, but every instinct she possessed was telling her that trouble was coming. Emma looked up from her textbooks, following Sarah's gaze to the window. "Those guys have been out there for a while," she observed. "They keep looking in here like they're planning something." The comment confirmed Sarah's assessment, and she made a decision that would prove crucial in the coming minutes. Moving behind the counter, she quietly reached for her phone and typed a quick message to Detective Rodriguez. "Your daughter is still at the shop. Some men outside acting suspicious. Might be nothing, but wanted you to know." The response came back within seconds. "On my way." "Keep her inside." Sarah glanced at the clock. 8:45. The shop officially closed at 9, but she had been planning to let Emma stay until her father arrived, as had become their routine. Now she realized that this routine might have put the girl in danger. The men outside had moved closer to the building, their intentions becoming clearer with each passing moment. Sarah's mind automatically shifted into tactical mode, assessing the coffee shop's layout, identifying potential weapons and escape routes, calculating response times, and threat levels. It was a mental process that had once been essential to her survival and the survival of others, but one she had hoped never to need again. Jenny had finished cleaning the espresso machine and was gathering her belongings, chatting casually about weekend plans while completely unaware of the growing tension. Paul was counting the day's receipts, focused on his task, and oblivious to what was developing outside. Emma continued studying, trusting in the safety of the familiar space she had come to consider as second home. Sarah watched the men through the window, her expression calm, but her senses heightened to a level of awareness that few civilians ever experienced. She could feel the familiar weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, the same feeling she had experienced countless times in hostile territory when the safety of others depended on her ability to assess threats and respond appropriately. The oldest man pulled out his phone and made a brief call, speaking in low tones while his eyes never left the coffee shop. When he ended the call, he gestured to his companions, and they began moving toward the entrance with purpose and coordination that confirmed Sarah's worst fears. She had perhaps 30 seconds to make decisions that would determine what happened next. Her civilian life, the quiet existence she had carefully constructed, was about to collide with the reality of who she had been trained to be. The woman who had spent months learning to blend in, to be unremarkable and safe, was about to discover that sometimes the past doesn't stay buried, and sometimes the skills you try to leave behind are exactly what the people around you need most. As the first man reached for the door handle, Sarah moved away from the window and positioned herself where she could see both the entrance and Emma's table. Her movements were subtle but deliberate, placing her body between the potential threat and the teenager who trusted her father's judgment in choosing this coffee shop as a safe place to study. The door chimed as it opened, the familiar sound now carrying a weight of impending danger. The four men entered in a formation that spoke of planning and coordination, their eyes immediately scanning the interior and cataloging the occupants. Jenny looked up with her usual welcoming smile, ready to explain that they were closing soon. Paul glanced over from the register, mildly annoyed at customers arriving so late. Emma remained focused on her calculus problems, unaware that her quiet evening of study was about to become something else entirely. Sarah stood perfectly still, her outward calm masking the complete transformation happening within her. The barista who had spent her evening making coffee and wiping tables was gone, replaced by the warrior who had once been considered one of the military's most effective operators. The transition was seamless and instantaneous, like flipping a switch that had been waiting to be activated. The oldest man stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Emma's table. When he spoke, his voice carried a cold authority that made everyone in the coffee shop pay attention. "We need to have a conversation with the detective's daughter." The words hung in the air like a threat made manifest. Emma's head snapped up from her textbooks, her face draining of color as she realized that these men knew exactly who she was and why she was here. Jenny's welcoming smile faltered, confusion replacing friendliness as she tried to process what was happening. Paul looked between the men and Emma, his businessman's instinct telling him that this situation was rapidly moving beyond anything his customer service training had prepared him for. Sarah remained motionless, but every nerve in her body was firing with information. The way the men had arranged themselves wasn't random. The leader had positioned himself in the center, where he could control the conversation and maintain visual command of the room. The youngest one had moved to block the main exit, his hand unconsciously hovering near his jacket pocket. The other two had spread out to cover different angles, one moving toward the counter where Jenny and Paul stood frozen, the other angling toward Emma's table, but keeping Sarah in his peripheral vision. These weren't opportunistic criminals. This was a coordinated operation with a specific target and a clear objective. Someone had told them exactly where to find Detective Rodriguez's daughter, what time she would be here, and that she would likely be alone except for the coffee shop staff. Emma's voice came out as barely a whisper. "I don't know what you want, but my dad will be here soon." The leader's laugh was cold and calculated. "Your dad is exactly the problem, sweetheart. Detective Rodriguez has been asking too many questions about things that don't concern him. Sometimes people need to be reminded that their actions have consequences for the people they care about." The pieces clicked into place in Sarah's mind with military precision. This was about Detective Rodriguez's current case, something significant enough that someone was willing to threaten his daughter to make him back off. The timing wasn't coincidental. They had chosen this moment when Emma would be vulnerable and isolated, when her father would be starting his night shift and wouldn't expect to pick her up for another hour. Jenny found her voice first, though it trembled as she spoke. "You need to leave. We're closing, and you can't just come in here threatening people." The man nearest the counter turned toward her, his expression making it clear that her intervention was unwelcome. "This doesn't concern you, lady. Just keep your mouth shut and do what you're told, and nobody has to get hurt." Paul stepped protectively closer to Jenny, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender, but his body language showing he was prepared to defend his coworker. Look, whatever this is about, it has nothing to do with us. Take whatever you want from the register and just leave. We don't want your money, the leader said dismissively. We want the detective to understand that some investigations need to end before they go too far. His daughter is going to help us deliver that message. Emma's calculus book slid off the table as she stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You can't do this. There are cameras. People know I'm here. My dad is a cop, and if you hurt me, the dad being a cop is exactly why we're here, the leader interrupted. And those cameras? My friend outside is taking care of the security system right now. As for people knowing you're here, well, that's why we waited until it was just you and the coffee shop workers. Sarah had heard enough. The men's confidence told her they had planned this thoroughly, which meant they had backup plans and exit strategies. The mention of someone outside handling the security system meant there were at least 5 people involved in this operation, possibly more. The fact that they were willing to threaten a police officer's daughter in such a public way suggested they either had significant resources backing them or were desperate enough to take extreme risks. Either scenario meant that Emma was in immediate and serious danger. The tactical assessment took less than 3 seconds. Sarah's eyes cataloged everything useful within reach. The heavy ceramic mugs behind the counter that could become projectiles, the hot coffee pot that could serve as both weapon and distraction, the industrial espresso machine that could provide cover, and the emergency exit behind the counter that led to the alley. She noted the positions of all 4 men, their relative sizes and apparent fitness levels, the way they moved and carried themselves, and which ones were likely armed based on their posture and hand positions. Most importantly, she calculated the distance between herself and Emma, between Emma and the nearest safe position, and between the threats and their ability to harm the people she had unconsciously already decided to protect. The youngest man by the door was nervous, which made him both the most unpredictable and potentially the most dangerous if things went wrong. The one near the counter was focused on Jenny and Paul, treating them as secondary threats to be managed rather than primary concerns. The third man was watching Sarah with a level of attention that suggested he might have military or law enforcement experience himself, which made him the most tactically aware of the group. The leader was clearly accustomed to intimidation working for him, his body language radiating confidence that his reputation and the threat of violence would be enough to control the situation. This made him the most important target, because neutralizing the leader would create confusion and hesitation in his subordinates. Sarah took a slow step toward the counter, her movements so casual and unthreatening that it drew no attention from the intruders. To anyone watching, she appeared to be simply moving toward her coworkers out of concern or confusion. In reality, she was positioning herself for optimal tactical advantage while moving closer to several items that could serve as weapons if the situation escalated. Emma was backing away from her table, her textbooks and papers scattered across the floor, her eyes wide with fear, but her voice growing stronger as anger began to overcome terror. My father helps people. He stops criminals. If you want to threaten someone, threaten him directly instead of hiding behind threats to hurt his family. The girl's courage impressed Sarah even as it increased the immediate danger. Emma was not going to be passive victim, which was admirable, but potentially disastrous in a situation where cooperation might be the safest course of action. The leader's expression hardened at Emma's defiance. He gestured to the man watching Sarah, who immediately began moving toward Emma's table with clear intent to physically control her. Enough talking, the leader said, his voice dropping to a register that carried unmistakable menace. We're walking out of here together, and you can come with us quietly. Your dad will get a phone call telling him exactly what he needs to do if he wants to see you again. This was the moment Sarah had been unconsciously preparing for since the men had entered the coffee shop. The situation had moved beyond threats and posturing into immediate physical danger for Emma and potentially for Jenny and Paul as well. The men were committed to their course of action, which meant negotiation was no longer possible. Sarah's hand was resting on the counter near the coffee pot when the man approaching Emma reached out to grab her arm. Emma jerked away from his touch, stumbling backwards and nearly falling over the chairs that had been stacked around a nearby table. "Don't touch her," Jenny called out, her protective instincts overcoming her fear. The man at the counter spun toward Jenny with sudden violence, his hand moving to his jacket in a motion that suggested he was reaching for a weapon. "I told you to keep your mouth shut." Paul stepped between the man and Jenny without hesitation, his hands coming up defensively. "Hey, back off. She's just scared." Sarah moved. The transition from stillness to action was so sudden and precise that it took several seconds for anyone in the room to process what had happened. One moment she was standing behind the counter looking like a frightened barista, and the next moment the coffee pot was flying through the air toward the man, threatening Jenny, while Sarah herself was vaulting over the counter with a speed and grace that defied her ordinary appearance. The hot coffee pot struck the man in the chest, causing him to stagger backwards with a cry of pain and surprise, his hand reflexively moving to the scalded area instead of completing his reach for whatever weapon he had been accessing. Paul grabbed Jenny and pulled her toward the emergency exit behind the counter, following training he had received years ago for exactly this type of situation. Sarah landed between Emma and the man who had been reaching for her body positioned in a combat stance that would have been immediately recognizable to anyone with military experience. The change in her demeanor was so complete that she seemed like an entirely different person, someone who belonged on a battlefield rather than behind a coffee counter. The leader's eyes widened as he reassessed the situation. "What the hell?" Sarah's voice cut through his words with an authority that filled the room. "You have 3 seconds to walk out that door and never come back." The man who had been approaching Emma recovered from his surprise and lunged toward Sarah, clearly expecting to overpower what he still assumed was an ordinary civilian woman. Sarah moved aside from his attack with minimal effort, grabbed his extended arm, and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the table Emma had been using moments before. Textbooks and papers scattered across the floor as the table collapsed under his weight. The leader was reaching inside his jacket when Sarah spoke again, her voice carrying a tone that made everyone in the room freeze. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." There was something in her voice that went beyond confidence, beyond threat, beyond anything the men had expected from their carefully planned operation. It carried the unmistakable ring of someone who had faced death many times and had always walked away from the encounter. The youngest man by the door looked between his leader and Sarah, uncertainty written across his face. The man who had been hit with the coffee pot was still cursing and trying to assess his burns while backing toward the exit. The one who had tried to grab Emma was struggling to get back to his feet among the scattered textbooks and broken furniture. Emma stood pressed against the wall, her eyes fixed on Sarah with an expression of complete shock. This was not the same woman who had brought her hot chocolate and encouraged her through difficult homework assignments. This was someone else entirely, someone dangerous and competent and utterly unafraid. The leader's hand had stopped moving toward his jacket, but his eyes were calculating new possibilities, reassessing threats and options with the rapid thinking of someone accustomed to violent situations. "You're making a mistake, lady," he said, his voice steady, but lacking the confidence it had carried moments before. "You have no idea who you're messing with or what this is really about." Sarah's response was delivered with the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. "I know exactly what this is about. You came here to threaten a 17-year-old girl to manipulate her father's investigation. You plan to kidnap her and use her as leverage against a police officer who is doing his job. You brought weapons into a coffee shop and threatened innocent people." She took a step forward, and something in her movement made all 4 men unconsciously step back. "What you don't know is who you're dealing with now." The man on the floor had managed to get to his hands and knees, blood trickling from where his face had connected with the table edge. He looked up at Sarah with a mixture of anger and confusion that suggested he was still trying to understand how barista had managed to throw him across the room so easily. "Break her jaw!" he screamed suddenly, his voice filled with rage and humiliation. "Just break her jaw and let's get out of here." The words were barely out of his mouth when Sarah revealed the full force of what 8 years as a Navy SEAL had taught her about dealing with multiple armed opponents in close quarters combat. The scream of rage from the man on the floor was the catalyst that transformed the coffee shop from a place of threats and posturing into an active battlefield. Sarah's response was immediate and devastating, demonstrating why she had been considered one of the most effective operators in her unit. The leader's hand completed its movement toward his jacket, finally, retrieving what appeared to be a compact pistol. Sarah was already moving before the weapon cleared his clothing. She closed the distance between them in 2 fluid steps, her left hand striking his wrist with enough force to send the gun spinning across the floor while her right hand delivered a precise blow to his solar plexus that doubled him over and left him gasping for air. The youngest man by the door, panicked by the sudden violence, pulled a knife from his pocket and started towards Sarah's exposed back. Emma, still pressed against the wall, shouted a warning that Sarah didn't need. Without turning around, Sarah swept her leg backwards in a movement that caught the young man's ankle and sent him tumbling toward the counter, where his head connected with the metal edge of a display case with a sound that made Emma wince. The man with the burned chest, still cursing about the hot coffee, had recovered enough to charge at Sarah from behind while she was dealing with the leader. Sarah sensed his approach and spun to meet him, using his momentum against him in a throw that sent him crashing through the large front window of the coffee shop. Safety glass scattered across the sidewalk in a cascade that glittered under the streetlights, and the man lay motionless in the debris. The man who had been trying to get up from the floor among Emma's scattered textbooks was still struggling to his feet when Sarah reached him. Her training had taught her the importance of neutralizing threats completely and quickly. A single strike to the side of his neck put him back down, this time unconsciously and likely to remain that way for several minutes. The entire confrontation had lasted less than 30 seconds. For armed men who had entered the coffee shop with confidence and a carefully planned operation now found themselves either unconscious, severely dazed, or nursing injuries that would require medical attention. The leader was still conscious but remained doubled over, struggling to breathe, and no longer showing any interest in continuing the fight. Sarah stood in the center of the coffee shop, her breathing steady and controlled, her clothes barely disheveled despite the violence that had just occurred. She scanned the room with the same systematic attention she had given it when the men first entered, ensuring that all threats were neutralized and that no one was in a position to cause further harm. Emma stared at her from against the wall, her mouth open in amazement and confusion. Jenny and Paul had emerged from behind the counter where they had taken shelter, their faces showing a mixture of relief and shock as they tried to process what they had just witnessed. The quiet, reliable barista they thought they knew had just single-handedly defeated 4 armed men with a level of skill and efficiency that belonged in action movies rather than real life. The leader managed to straighten up enough to speak, his voice hoarse from the blow to his diaphragm. "You have no idea what you've just done. This isn't over." Sarah's response was delivered with the same calm authority she had maintained throughout the confrontation. "Yes, it is. You came here to threaten a child, and you failed. Your operation is blown, your team is neutralized, and the police are already on their way." As if summoned by her words, the sound of sirens became audible in the distance, growing rapidly louder. Detective Rodriguez had clearly taken Sarah's text message seriously and had called for backup before heading to the coffee shop himself. The leader's eyes widened at the sound of approaching law enforcement, and he began looking around desperately for an escape route. The front window was blocked by his unconscious associate lying in the safety glass. The main door was closer to where Sarah stood than to where he could reach it, and the emergency exit behind the counter would require him to get past Jenny and Paul, who were now watching him with expressions that suggested they would be happy to prevent his escape. "Don't even think about it," Sarah advised, noting his calculating glances. "You're going to sit down on that chair and wait for Detective Rodriguez to arrive. If you try to run, I will stop you, and you won't enjoy the experience." There was something in her tone that convinced him she was not making an idle threat. The leader slowly lowered himself into the chair she had indicated, his hands visible and his posture indicating surrender. Emma finally found her voice, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Sarah, who are you?" It was a question that Sarah had hoped never to answer in this context. She had spent months building a life where that question had a simple, safe answer. She was a barista who made good coffee and kept to herself. Now, standing in a coffee shop littered with unconscious attackers and broken furniture, that simple answer was clearly inadequate. I used to do different work, Sarah replied carefully, maintaining her watch over the leader while beginning to process the implications of what had just happened. Her cover was blown, her quiet life was over, and depending on who these men represented and what Detective Rodriguez was investigating, she might be in as much danger as Emma had been. Paul stepped carefully around the debris from the broken table, his eyes moving between Sarah and the unconscious man near the window. Different work like what? Military? Police? Something like that, Sarah confirmed, not yet ready to elaborate. The sound of sirens was much closer now, and she could see flashing lights approaching through the remaining intact windows of the coffee shop. Jenny had pulled out her cell phone and was taking pictures of the scene, her journalistic instincts overcoming her shock. She had been studying communications at the community college and understood the importance of documenting what had happened. Sarah, this is incredible. You just saved Emma's life. You saved all of us. Emma pushed herself away from the wall and took a few tentative steps towards Sarah, her textbooks forgotten on the floor among the scattered papers and broken furniture. That man said they wanted to send my father a message. They were going to kidnap me to make him stop some investigation. Sarah nodded, her attention still partially focused on the leader, who was showing signs of considering whether he might be able to escape before the police arrived. Your father must be working on something that someone wants stopped badly enough to threaten his family. This was a coordinated operation with multiple people involved. They knew your schedule, they knew where you would be, and they had planned to take you. The implications hit Emma like a physical blow. They've been watching me. They know where I go to school, where I spend my time. Even after tonight, I won't be safe. It was a realization that Sarah had been wrestling with since the moment the men had revealed their purpose. This hadn't been a random crime or a spur-of-the-moment decision. Someone with significant resources had ordered this operation, which meant they likely had the ability to try again with different personnel and different tactics. The first police car pulled up outside the coffee shop, its flashing lights illuminating the broken glass, and the unconscious man lying among the debris. Detective Rodriguez was driving, and Sarah could see his face through the windshield as he took in the scene. His expression showed a mixture of relief at seeing his daughter apparently unharmed and shock at the evidence of violence that surrounded her. 2 more police cars arrived within seconds, disgorging officers who immediately began securing the area and checking on the status of the men scattered around the coffee shop. Detective Rodriguez pushed through the door with his gun drawn, though he lowered it quickly when he saw that the immediate threat had passed. Emma, he rushed to his daughter, pulling her into a fierce hug while his eyes continued to scan the room, cataloging the scene with professional thoroughness. Are you hurt? What happened here? Dad, I'm okay. Sarah protected us. I don't know how she did it, but she stopped all of them before they could hurt anyone. Detective Rodriguez looked at Sarah with new attention, noting her calm demeanor and the way she stood positioned to maintain visual control over all the entrances and the surviving attacker. His trained eye picked up details about her posture and bearing that suggested military experience, and he began reassessing everything he thought he knew about the woman who had been serving him coffee for the past several months. Miss Mitchell, I need you to tell me exactly what happened here. Sarah glanced at Emma, then at Jenny and Paul, finally settling her attention back on Detective Rodriguez. The decision she had been avoiding since moving to Seattle was no longer hers to make. Her past was about to become public knowledge, along with all the complications that would bring. 4 men entered the shop just before 9 o'clock. She began, delivering her report with the precision and attention to detail that had been drilled into her during years of military debriefings. They had been conducting surveillance from outside for approximately 20 minutes before entering. Their leader identified her daughter by name and indicated that they intended to use her as leverage to influence your current investigation. Detective Rodriguez's expression grew grimmer with each detail of Sarah's account. The professional way she delivered information, the tactical terminology she used, and the systematic manner in which she described the events all pointed to a background that went far beyond civilian experience. One of the other officers approached to report on the status of the attackers. 3 unconscious, 1 conscious but not going anywhere. The one who went through the window has a concussion and some lacerations, but he'll live. Paramedics are on the way. Detective Rodriguez nodded, then turned back to Sarah. Miss Mitchell, I'm going to need a detailed statement from you, and I suspect this incident is connected to something much larger than a simple assault. Before we continue, I need to know who I'm really talking to. Sarah looked around the coffee shop that had been her sanctuary, taking in the broken furniture, the scattered papers, and the evidence of violence that would forever change how this place felt to her. She thought about the quiet life she had built, the anonymity she had cultivated, and the peace she had found in the simple routine of making coffee and serving customers who knew her only as the reliable barista who remembered their orders. All of that was over now. My name is Sarah Michelle Mitchell, Senior Chief Petty Officer, United States Navy, retired. I served 8 years as a SEAL, including 3 deployments to Afghanistan. I moved to Seattle 6 months ago and took this job because I wanted to leave that life behind. The words hung in the air like a confession, and Sarah could see the shock registering on Emma's face, the amazement in Jenny's expression, and the sudden understanding in Paul's eyes. Detective Rodriguez's expression shifted from confusion to respect as he began to comprehend the level of training and experience that had just saved his daughter's life. Sarah, Emma said softly, you're a real hero. Sarah shook her head. I'm a barista who used to do different work. Tonight was what needed to happen to keep you safe. But even as she said the words, Sarah knew that everything had changed. The men who had targeted Emma weren't going to simply disappear because their first attempt had failed. Detective Rodriguez was investigating something significant enough that someone was willing to threaten a police officer's family to stop him. And Sarah's cover was blown completely, which meant that anyone looking for former military personnel with her particular skill set now knew exactly where to find her. The quiet life was over. The question now was what would replace it, and whether Sarah was ready to acknowledge that some battles follow you no matter how far you run from them. Detective Rodriguez was speaking into his radio, calling for additional units, and requesting that his supervisor be notified of the incident. Sarah listened to his conversation and realized that this was just the beginning of what was likely to be a very long night of questions, reports, and investigations. Emma was still staring at her with a mixture of amazement and curiosity that suggested she had hundreds of questions about Sarah's military service and what it meant to be a Navy SEAL. Jenny and Paul were whispering to each other, clearly trying to reconcile the woman they thought they knew with the warrior who had just defended them all. The paramedics arrived and began treating the injured attackers, their professional demeanor not quite hiding their amazement at the precision with which the men had been neutralized. Sarah overheard one of them commenting to his partner that whoever had done this knew exactly how much force to use to incapacitate without causing permanent damage. More police officers continued to arrive, along with crime scene technicians who began photographing and documenting everything. Sarah found herself answering the same questions multiple times as different investigators tried to piece together the sequence of events. Through it all, she maintained the calm, professional demeanor that had served her well in much more dangerous situations than this one. But internally, she was grappling with the realization that the life she had tried to build in Seattle was collapsing around her, and she had no idea what would take its place. The Seattle Police Department's interview room felt cramped and sterile compared to the coffee shop that had been Sarah's world for the past 6 months. Detective Rodriguez sat across from her, a stack of files spread between them, his expression serious as he prepared to share information that would explain why his daughter had been targeted and what Sarah had unknowingly walked into. It was nearly midnight. The coffee shop had been cordoned off as a crime scene. Statements had been taken from multiple witnesses, and the 4 attackers were either in custody or under guard at the hospital. Emma was safe at home with her mother and a protective detail that Rodriguez had arranged through his supervisor. Jenny and Paul had been interviewed and released, though both had stayed long enough to make sure Sarah was okay before finally heading home. Before we continue, Rodriguez began, I need you to understand that what I'm about to tell you is part of an ongoing investigation that involves organized crime, police corruption, and threats that go far beyond what happened tonight. Sarah nodded, already recognizing the tone of a briefing that would change everything she thought she knew about her quiet new life in Seattle. I figured this wasn't about a simple robbery gone wrong. Rodriguez opened the top file and slid a photograph across the table. Sarah found herself looking at a crime scene photo that showed the aftermath of what appeared to be a professional assassination. Two men in expensive suits lay dead in what looked like the parking garage of an upscale building, their bodies positioned in a way that spoke of execution rather than a struggle. 3 weeks ago, these two men were killed in downtown Seattle, Rodriguez explained. Marcus Chun and David Torres, both of them federal prosecutors working on a case involving money laundering and racketeering charges against the Kozlov organization. Sarah studied the photograph with the analytical eye of someone who had seen her share of violent death. Professional hit. Clean, efficient, designed to send a message. That's what we thought too. The Kozlov organization has been operating in the Pacific Northwest for nearly a decade, running everything from drug trafficking to illegal gambling to human trafficking. Chun and Torres had built a case that would have put the entire leadership structure behind bars for life. Rodriguez slid another file across the table, this one containing surveillance photographs of a man in his 50s with graying hair and cold eyes. Viktor Kozlov, the head of the organization, Russian immigrant who came to the United States 15 years ago with enough money and connections to establish himself as a major player in organized crime. He's smart, ruthless, and has never been successfully prosecuted for anything more serious than a parking ticket. Sarah looked at the photograph, memorizing details automatically. And you think he ordered the hit on the prosecutors? I know he did. What I can't prove is how he knew exactly where Chun and Torres would be that night, or how his people got past federal security measures that should have made them untouchable. The implication was clear, and Sarah understood why Rodriguez's investigation had prompted such an extreme response. You think Kozlov has someone inside law enforcement feeding him information? Rodriguez nodded grimly. That's what I've been investigating for the past 3 weeks. Looking at communication records, financial information, trying to identify which federal agent or police officer is betraying information to the Kozlov organization. Sarah leaned back in her chair, processing the broader picture that was emerging. And someone found out about your investigation and decided to use your daughter as leverage to make you stop. That's what tonight was about. The message was clear. Back off the corruption investigation or Emma pays the price. Rodriguez's hands clenched into fists as he spoke, his anger barely controlled. What they didn't count on was running into someone with your particular skill set. Sarah considered the tactical implications of what Rodriguez had shared. If Kozlov has someone inside law enforcement, then your investigation is compromised. He knows what you know, what evidence you've collected, and what your next moves are likely to be. Which is why I'm sitting here talking to you instead of briefing my superiors, Rodriguez admitted. Until I know who I can trust, I can't risk sharing sensitive information through official channels. It was a position that Sarah recognized from her military experience, the impossible situation of needing to complete a mission while not knowing which members of your own team might be working against you. What do you need from me? Rodriguez looked surprised by the directness of her question. I need to know if you're willing to help me finish what I started. Kozlov's organization tried to hurt my daughter tonight, and they'll try again. The only way to protect Emma and end this threat is to expose the corruption that's protecting Kozlov and his people. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, weighing the implications of what Rodriguez was proposing. 6 months ago, she had made a conscious decision to leave the world of violence and danger behind, to build a life where her biggest concern was perfecting latte art and remembering customer orders. Getting involved in Rodriguez's investigation would mean abandoning that peaceful existence and returning to the kind of high-stakes situation she had hoped never to face again. What specifically are you asking me to do? I need someone I can trust to help me identify the corrupt agent, someone with the skills to handle dangerous situations and the training to operate independently if necessary. Tonight proved that you have both the tactical ability and the moral courage to do what needs to be done. Sarah thought about Emma's face as the attackers had threatened her, about the girl's courage in standing up to men who intended to use her as a weapon against her father. She thought about Jenny and Paul, ordinary people who had been put in danger simply because they worked in the wrong place at the wrong time. She thought about the federal prosecutors who had been murdered for trying to do their jobs. Tell me about your investigation. What evidence do you have? What leads are you following? And who else knows about your suspicions? Rodriguez opened another file, this one containing financial records, communication logs, and surveillance reports. I started by looking at the timing of the prosecutor murders. Chun and Torres were supposed to be in a safe house that night, but they received a call directing them to meet with an informant who claimed to have crucial evidence about the Kozlov organization. A call that led them into an ambush. Exactly. The call came from a number that traced back to a prepaid phone purchased with cash, so no direct connection to identify the caller. But the timing was perfect, which meant someone with access to federal protection protocols knew exactly when and where to set up the meeting. Sarah studied the communication records, her trained eye picking up patterns and connections that might not be obvious to someone without intelligence analysis experience. How many people would have had access to the prosecutor's protection details? That's the problem. At least 12 federal agents, 6 local police officers involved in joint task force operations, and an unknown number of administrative personnel who handle scheduling and communication for witness protection. It was a large pool of potential suspects, which would make identifying the corrupt individual extremely difficult through conventional investigation methods. Any of them show unusual financial activity, new purchases, lifestyle changes, anything that might indicate they're being paid for information. Rodriguez nodded. That's where things get interesting. 3 weeks before the prosecutor murders, federal agent Lisa Hartwell purchased a new BMW with cash. Agent Thomas Morrison put a down payment on a house that's worth twice his annual salary. And Detective Michael Chun, no relation to the murdered prosecutor, has been making regular deposits to an offshore account. Sarah noted the names, already beginning to formulate approaches for investigating each suspect. Have you shared these findings with anyone? Only with my direct supervisor, Captain Williams, and only in general terms. I told him I was investigating possible connections between the prosecutor murders and local organized crime, but I didn't mention the corruption angle. The answer satisfied Sarah's immediate concern about operational security, but it also meant that Rodriguez was essentially operating alone in an investigation that involved federal crimes and organized crime connections. You realize that if any of these 3 suspects is the corrupt agent, and if Kozlov's organization is as well connected as you believe, then your investigation is probably already compromised. That's why I need help from someone outside the official law enforcement structure, someone who can operate independently and doesn't appear in any personnel files that Kozlov's contact might have access to. Sarah understood what Rodriguez was really asking. He needed someone who could conduct surveillance, gather intelligence, and potentially engage in direct action against dangerous criminals without official oversight or support. It was exactly the kind of work she had done during her military service, but it would mean abandoning any pretense of returning to civilian life. If I agree to help you, what resources would I have access to? Equipment, information, backup if things go wrong. Rodriguez reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device that looked like an ordinary cell phone. Secure communication device, encrypted and unmonitored. My direct contact information is programmed in. I can provide you with background information on all the suspects, access to surveillance equipment, and unofficial support if you run into situations that require police response. Sarah took the device, recognizing it as military-grade equipment that would have cost more than Rodriguez made in several months. This isn't standard police issue. I have contacts from my time in the Army who understand the importance of operational security when dealing with organized crime. They've been helpful in providing resources that aren't available through official channels. The admission revealed another layer of complexity to the situation. Rodriguez wasn't just a local detective investigating a case. He was someone with military connections and access to specialized equipment, which meant he had been planning this investigation for some time and had anticipated the need for unconventional approaches. What's your timeline for this investigation? How long do we have before Kozlov realizes that his first attempt to pressure you failed and tries something more direct? Rodriguez's expression grew even more serious. Based on what happened tonight, I'd estimate we have maybe a week before Kozlov escalates to direct threats against me or tries another approach to target Emma. If we can identify his contact within law enforcement and gather enough evidence to expose the corruption, we can break up his information network and make it much harder for him to operate. Sarah looked at the files spread across the table, taking in the scope of what Rodriguez was proposing. This wasn't just about stopping a single criminal organization. It was about exposing corruption that went to the heart of the law enforcement agencies that were supposed to protect people like Emma. The stakes were high, the risks were significant, and failure would likely result in more deaths and continued danger for innocent people. But it was also exactly the kind of mission that had motivated her to become a SEAL in the first place, protecting people who couldn't protect themselves and fighting against those who abuse power for personal gain. I'll need operational freedom to investigate the suspects using whatever methods I determine are necessary. No restrictions based on legal procedures or departmental policies. Rodriguez nodded. Understood. This is about stopping criminals and protecting innocent people, not about following bureaucratic rules that Kozlov's organization has already figured out how to circumvent. Sarah made her decision with the same certainty that had guided her through countless dangerous situations during her military service. Then I'm in. We identify the corrupt agent, expose the connection to Kozlov's organization, and make sure Emma and other potential victims are safe. As she spoke the words, Sarah felt a familiar sense of purpose settling over her, the feeling of being exactly where she needed to be to do work that mattered. The quiet life she had tried to build was over, but perhaps it had been an illusion anyway. Perhaps some people are meant to be warriors, and the only choice is whether to accept that responsibility willingly or have it thrust upon you by circumstances beyond your control. Rodriguez extended his hand across the table. Thank you, Sarah. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you moved to Seattle. Sarah shook his hand, her grip firm and confident. Actually, Detective, I think this might be exactly what I signed up for. I just didn't realize it at the time. Outside the interview room, the Seattle Police Department continued its normal operations, unaware that a former Navy SEAL had just agreed to undertake an unauthorized investigation that would either expose a significant corruption network or result in more violence against innocent people. Either way, Sarah Mitchell, the barista, was gone forever. What emerged from that interview room was something much more dangerous. A warrior with a mission and the skills to accomplish it regardless of the obstacles that stood in her way. The abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Seattle's industrial district had been Sarah's base of operations for 3 days. Rodriguez had arranged for her to use the space through one of his military contacts, and Sarah had quickly transformed it into a tactical operations center that would have impressed her former SEAL team commanders. Maps of Seattle covered one wall, marked with locations relevant to the investigation. The federal building where the murder prosecutors had worked, the parking garage where they had been killed, the homes and regular haunts of the 3 suspected corrupt agents, and known meeting places for Kozlov organization members. A second wall displayed photographs, financial records, and communication logs connected to the investigation, all arranged in a pattern that told a story of corruption and betrayal. Sarah stood before this intelligence wall, dressed in black tactical clothing, her hair pulled back severely, looking every inch the experienced operator she had once been. The transformation from coffee shop barista to active warrior was complete, and anyone who had known her from Brew Haven would have found her almost unrecognizable. Her investigation had moved quickly, aided by skills that civilian law enforcement couldn't legally employ. She had conducted surveillance on all 3 suspects, photographed their activities, tracked their movements, and gathered intelligence through methods that would never be admissible in court, but which had revealed patterns that pointed toward one suspect more strongly than the others. Detective Michael Chun was dirty. The evidence was circumstantial, but compelling. Chun had been present at every briefing where information about the prosecutor protection details had been discussed. His financial records showed regular deposits that coincided with major Kozlov organization operations. Most damning of all, Sarah's surveillance had recorded him meeting with known Kozlov associates on 3 separate occasions over the past month. But Sarah needed more than circumstantial evidence. She needed proof that would be strong enough to expose the corruption network and protect Emma from future threats. That meant getting close enough to Chun to record him receiving money or instructions from Kozlov's people, which would require infiltrating his network of criminal contacts. It was dangerous work that carried significant personal risk. If Kozlov's organization discovered that someone was investigating their police connection, they would eliminate the threat quickly and efficiently. If other corrupt law enforcement officers were involved and discovered Sarah's activities, she could face official charges for conducting unauthorized surveillance and investigation. But the alternative was allowing the corruption to continue, which would mean more deaths and continued danger for people like Emma Rodriguez. Sarah's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from Rodriguez. Chin scheduled to meet contact tonight. Harbor District, Pier 47, 11 p.m. Opportunity for direct surveillance. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. Night vision goggles, directional microphone, digital camera with telephoto lens, backup weapon, and communication gear. She had learned during her military service that successful operations depended on thorough preparation and contingency planning. The message also contained additional intelligence that Rodriguez had gathered through official channels. Viktor Kozlov himself was reportedly in Seattle for a meeting with his organization's local leadership, which suggested that tonight's meeting might involve more than routine information exchange. At 10:30, Sarah was positioned in an abandoned building overlooking Pier 47, her equipment set up to provide optimal surveillance of the meeting location. The Harbor District at night was a maze of shadows and industrial equipment, perfect for clandestine meetings, but also dangerous for someone operating alone without backup. Detective Chun arrived first, parking his personal car in a location that provided quick escape routes in multiple directions. His body language showed nervous energy and constant awareness of his surroundings, the behavior of someone who knew he was engaged in dangerous and illegal activities. At 11:15, a black sedan pulled up near Chen's position. 2 men got out, both wearing expensive suits and moving with the confident precision of professional criminals. Sarah recognized one of them from Rodriguez's files, Dmitry Petrov, Viktor Kozlov's lieutenant, and the person responsible for maintaining the organization's law enforcement contacts. Through her directional microphone, Sarah could hear fragments of their conversation as Chun approached the sedan. Information about the federal investigation. Chen's voice was tense, worried. Kozlov wants to know about the detective who's been asking questions. Petrov's voice carried a Russian accent and the cold authority of someone accustomed to violence. Sarah adjusted her equipment to get clearer audio and began recording everything. This was exactly the kind of evidence that Rodriguez would need to expose Chen's corruption and connect it directly to the Kozlov organization. Rodriguez is getting close to identifying the leak, Chun continued. He's been requesting files, interviewing people, building a case. It's only a matter of time before he connects the dots. Petrov handed Chun an envelope, which Sarah assumed contained either money or instructions. Then, perhaps it's time to eliminate Detective Rodriguez as a problem. We already tried to pressure him through his daughter, but that failed. Sarah's blood ran cold at the casual way Petrov discussed murdering a police officer. This wasn't just about corruption anymore. It was about preventing additional murders. I can't be involved in anything that direct, Chin protested. If something happens to Rodriguez right after he's been investigating corruption, it will bring federal attention that none of us can afford. Your concerns are noted, Petrov replied dismissively. But Mr. Kozlov's instructions are clear. The detective's investigation ends, one way or another. If you can't find a way to discredit him or transfer him to a different assignment, then more direct measures will be necessary. Sarah had heard enough to confirm Chen's guilt and the immediate danger facing Rodriguez and his family. But as she prepared to withdraw from her surveillance position, she noticed movement in the shadows around the pier that suggested additional security measures she hadn't detected during her initial reconnaissance. 3 more men had positioned themselves around the meeting location, armed and alert for potential threats. Sarah realized that Kozlov's people had taken much more extensive security precautions than she had anticipated, which meant her presence might already be known. Her tactical training kicked in automatically. She was outnumbered in unfamiliar territory with limited escape routes and no backup support. The smart move would be to withdraw immediately and report what she had learned to Rodriguez. But as Sarah began packing her equipment, she heard Petrov's voice again, this time discussing specific plans for targeting Emma Rodriguez if her father didn't stop his investigation. The girl goes to Lincoln High School. She has chemistry class every Tuesday and Thursday at 2:15. She walks home alone most days, takes the same route through Volunteer Park. If the detective won't listen to reason, perhaps watching his daughter disappear will provide the motivation he needs. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. These men were calmly discussing kidnapping a 17-year-old girl, and they had clearly been conducting detailed surveillance to identify the best opportunity to take her. Sarah's decision was instantaneous and irrevocable. She couldn't allow Emma to remain in danger while she followed proper procedures and built a legal case against Chun. The threat was immediate and specific, which meant her response needed to be equally immediate. Moving silently through the shadows of the abandoned building, Sarah approached the pier from an angle that would put her behind the closest security guard. Her approach was soundless, a skill that had kept her alive during countless night operations in hostile territory. The first guard never saw her coming. Sarah struck to the base of his skull, dropped him unconscious before he could raise an alarm. She relieved him of his weapon and communication device, then continued toward the main meeting location. The second guard was more alert, turning towards Sarah's position just as she reached striking distance. But 8 years of training against opponents who were trying to kill her had taught Sarah that hesitation meant death. Her response was swift and decisive, leaving the second guard as unconscious as the first. Petrov and Chun were still talking when Sarah reached a position where she could intervene directly in their meeting. Through her directional microphone, she heard Petrov issuing specific instructions for Chun to gather information about Emma's schedule and security arrangements. Sarah made her final tactical assessment. Petrov was armed and experienced. Chun was likely armed and certainly desperate, and the third security guard was positioned where he could provide covering fire or escape support. The odds were not favorable for a direct assault, but allowing the meeting to continue meant accepting that Emma would be targeted for kidnapping within the next few days. The choice was clear. Sarah emerged from the shadows with her weapon drawn, moving into the open where all three men could see her clearly. Her voice carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had faced death many times and had always been the one left standing. Detective Chun, you're under arrest for conspiracy, corruption, and accessory to murder. The reaction was immediate and violent. Chun dove toward his car while reaching for his service weapon. Petrov spun toward Sarah while drawing a pistol from inside his jacket. The third security guard appeared from behind a shipping container with an automatic weapon already raised. Sarah's response demonstrated why she had been considered one of the most effective operators in her unit. Her first shot took down the guard with the automatic weapon before he could fire. Her second shot disarmed Petrov without killing him. Her third shot disabled Chin's car by puncturing the radiator, preventing his escape. In less than 10 seconds, the tactical situation had reversed completely. Sarah stood in control of the pier, her weapon trained on Petrov, while Chun crouched behind his disabled vehicle with his hands visible. "This is how this works," Sarah announced, her voice carrying across the water with deadly calm. "Detective Chun, you're going to confess to everything you've done for the Kozlov organization. Petrov, you're going to provide information about planned operations against Detective Rodriguez and his family. And both of you are going to cooperate because the alternative is much worse." Petrov's response was defiant despite his wounded condition. "You have no authority here. You're not police, you're not federal agents. Anything you do to us is kidnapping and assault." Sarah's smile was cold and utterly without mercy. "I'm a United States Navy SEAL, and what you just described is planning terrorist attacks against American citizens and law enforcement officers. Under the circumstances, I have all the authority I need." The words carried weight that went beyond legal technicalities. Petrov was looking at someone who had been trained to eliminate threats to American security, and his expression showed that he understood exactly how precarious his situation had become. Chen raised his head above his car window, his face pale with fear and desperation. You don't understand what you're getting into. Kozlov's organization has resources you can't imagine. If you interfere with our operations, they'll hunt you down and eliminate you. They can try, Sarah replied with the confidence of someone who had survived 8 years of combat operations against enemies who were much better equipped and more dangerous than organized criminals in Seattle. But first, you're going to tell me everything about the corruption network, and you're going to help me make sure Emma Rodriguez stays safe. As sirens began to sound in the distance, indicating that Rodriguez had called for backup support as planned, Sarah realized that her quiet life was truly over forever. But looking at the defeated criminals before her, knowing that Emma would be safe and that the corruption network was about to be exposed, she felt a sense of purpose and satisfaction that no amount of coffee shop routine had ever provided. Sometimes the past doesn't stay buried. Sometimes the skills you try to leave behind are exactly what the world needs most. And sometimes a warrior discovers that walking away from the fight is not the same thing as finding peace. Sarah Mitchell, the barista, was gone. What remained was someone much more dangerous and far more valuable, a protector who would do whatever was necessary to keep innocent people safe from those who would harm them. The hunt was over. Justice was just beginning.